it doesn't distinguish girls' sports at what age. It doesn't distinguish whether you're an Olympic athlete, an NCAA player, a high school sports player regulated by your state, or whether you're just playing soccer as a 4-year-old or 5-year-old down the street. It potentially could lead to inspections, individuals raising concerns, and how you proceed with that is something that is concerning to the House Democratic Caucus. And so that's why, we felt that this is the GOP Child Predator Empowerment Act, and this puts kids at risk, whether you play gymnastics, whether you play football, or whether you're a wrestler. This puts you at risk. Kids as young as 4 could be asked.
When I watch Pete Aguilar stand at that microphone tearing into this grotesque piece of Republican theater, I feel everything, because the absolute moral emergency of this moment demands we interrogate what happens when a political movement so thoroughly committed to cruelty wraps its sadism in the language of protection. And this is what fascism looks like in its early stages, when it needs a vulnerable population to scapegoat, and so it picks trans children, because they represent less than 1% of student athletes, and the GOP knows exactly what it's doing in January 2025, making this the second bill they brought to the floor of the United States House of Representatives, behind only their border crackdown, because the architecture of authoritarian control requires an enemy, and when you can make that enemy, children who just want to play soccer with their friends, you have descended into a moral abyss that history will remember the same way it remembers every other campaign of state-sponsored dehumanization. And wait until you hear how they're actually planning to enforce this nightmare. Pete Aguilar blasted the bill's impact on women and girls of all ages, warning it could lead to personal inspections of kids as young as 4 with nothing in the bill requiring parental consent. And we need to pause right here, because what Aguilar is describing with surgical precision is the creation of a federal apparatus that would empower adults to interrogate, challenge, and physically inspect children's bodies based on nothing more than suspicion or accusation. When asked to clarify what enforcement would look like, Republican Representative Tim Walberg said the legislation doesn't deal with that, which is perhaps the most chilling admission of all, because they know exactly what door they're opening, and they simply don't care. The deliberate vagueness is the point, because the bill, which lacks a clear enforcement mechanism, could subject women and girls to physical inspection by an adult if someone from an opposing team accused them of being transgender, and suddenly we're living in a world where any girl who runs too fast, throws too hard, grows too tall, or simply doesn't perform femininity in the precise way her competitors expect can be subjected to what Democrats are correctly and unflinchingly calling state-sanctioned sexual abuse. And you think I'm being hyperbolic, but stick with me, because this gets so much worse. The House bill passed in January 2025 after making its way to the Republican-held Senate, ahead of Trump returning to office with Aguilar calling it the GOP Child Predator Empowerment Act. And the name is not rhetorical flourish. The name is diagnostic precision, because what else do you call legislation that creates conditions under which adults can demand access to children's bodies? Representative Lori Trahan, a former Division I athlete and mother of 2 girls, asked this exact question on the House floor, and listen to how she framed it, because this is the bombshell that should make every parent in America lose sleep tonight, when she said girls as young as 4 years old, being subjected to invasive lines of questioning about their bodies, and even physical inspections by an adult stranger, a predator, all because some creep accuses them of not being a girl, and there it is, stripped of all pretense, the recognition that this bill doesn't protect children. It exposes them to precisely the kind of violation that Republicans claim to be preventing. Now here's where the intellectual dishonesty reaches truly staggering proportions, because transgender athletes make up well under 1% of NCAA players across all sports, according to NCAA player President Charlie Baker. When testifying before Congress in December 2024, Baker said he was aware of fewer than 10 transgender athletes among the more than 500,000 student athletes governed by the organization, which means Republicans have manufactured a federal crisis complete with Title IX amendments and funding threats to address a statistical phantom. But the cruelty is the point, isn't it? Because over 1/3 of states have already passed laws banning transgender students from participating in sports consistent with their gender identity, and this federal bill, which passed 218 to 206 with 2 Democrats voting in favor and 1 voting present, represents not evidence-based policymaking, but rather the culmination of a multi-year propaganda campaign that spent tens of millions of dollars convincing Americans that their daughters are under siege from an enemy that barely exists. But let's go deeper into the enforcement question, because this is where Republicans reveal their entire game. In Ohio, when similar legislation passed, anyone could accuse someone else of being transgender, thus prompting a chain reaction, where if someone is suspected to be transgender, she must go through evaluations of her external and internal genitalia, testosterone levels, and genetic makeup, and once inspected, the girl or woman has to give a signed physician statement indicating their sex. And I want you to sit with that for a moment. The image of a middle school girl who excelled at track being pulled aside because a parent from another team decided she looked too masculine, and now she and her family must navigate the trauma of proving her womanhood to the satisfaction of the state, and doctors who perform these examinations have said they are invasive and uncomfortable, even for adult women who have close, trusting relationships with their physicians, and they can only imagine the trauma a middle school or high school girl would experience first on being accused of not being a true girl, and then having to undergo an invasive and painful exam, which means we're talking about creating a medical legal infrastructure designed to traumatize children in the name of fairness. The historical parallels here should make us all profoundly uncomfortable, because every authoritarian movement requires scapegoats and the architecture is always the same. Identify a vulnerable minority population, preferably one that most people don't personally know, flood the discourse with dehumanizing rhetoric, present that population as an existential threat, particularly to children, and then deploy state power to erase them from public life. And the Trump administration, beginning in January 2025, has taken a series of actions specifically targeting transgender people, including removing federal recognition and eliminating many legal rights, with these actions forming part of the broader 2020s anti-LGBTQ movement in the United States, while previous orders have sought to have the federal government reject the idea that people can transition to a gender other than the one assigned at birth, with implications for areas including passports and prisons, and opening the door to barring transgender service members from the military, and ending federal funding for gender-affirming care for transgender people under age 19, which is the systematic legal erasure of an entire class of human beings from civic participation. And if you think I'm catastrophizing, consider that 2025 is shaping up to be even more challenging than the record-breaking year for anti-trans legislation, with nearly 120 anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ bills already filed in states nationwide, far surpassing the 80 bills filed by this time in 2023. And now we arrive at what I consider the most important intellectual and moral reckoning that progressives must face, which is that Mike Johnson stood at a podium after this vote and said, "We know from Scripture and from nature that men are men and women are women, and men cannot become women," thereby making explicit what has always been implicit in Republican governance, which is that they seek to impose a narrow fundamentalist Christian understanding of gender and sexuality on a pluralistic democracy through the coercive power of the state. And this should alarm anyone who believes in the Enlightenment project, because what we're witnessing is not a sincere debate about athletic fairness. It's a theocratic movement using legislative power to enforce religious doctrine, and the target today is trans kids, but the framework they're building can be deployed against anyone who fails to conform to their vision of proper gender performance, and I mean anyone. The enforcement mechanism question matters so profoundly because the preponderance of evidence, including the text of the law, testimony from legislators, and the uncertainty surrounding how its provisions will be enforced, suggest that genital inspections are a possibility, and lawmakers have effectively legalized the abuse of children they claim to be protecting. And this isn't speculation, because Republican legislation would give someone unspecified the right to physically inspect a girl or young woman if an opposing team accuses them of being transgender, subjecting women and girls to physical inspection by an adult, which creates a system where accusation becomes investigation, and investigation requires bodily examination, and suddenly we've constructed a machinery of surveillance and violation that would make Foucault weep, because the disciplinary power here operates through the threat of exposure, the constant possibility that any girl who exceeds expectations or fails to perform femininity correctly will be subject to the ultimate invasion of privacy. Now let's talk about what Democrats did in response, because Senate Democrats voted unanimously to block the Republican-led bill in a party line vote of 51 to 45, as Democrats filibustered the legislation, and it fell short of the 60 votes needed to advance, which represents one of those rare moments of genuine moral courage and political unity that we so desperately need more of, because Senate Democrats were unified in blocking a trans sports ban, and their ability to block these bills depends on their use of the filibuster, as 60 votes are needed to end debate in the Senate, so Republicans would have needed some Democrats on board, and thank whatever deity or moral force you believe in that Democrats held the line here, because the alternative would have been catastrophic, not just for trans kids, but for every child in America who would suddenly be living under a regime where bodily autonomy can be violated based on nothing more than suspicion. But we have to acknowledge the profound asymmetry in how this issue has been weaponized, because a New York Times Ipsos poll found that when asked whether transgender female athletes, meaning athletes who were male at birth but currently identify as female, should be allowed to compete in women's sports, 79% of American adults said they should not be allowed, while 18% said they should be allowed, which means Republicans have successfully manipulated public opinion through years of coordinated propaganda that presents trans girls as predatory males invading female spaces when the reality is, we're talking about children who simply want to participate in the same activities as their peers, and limited studies on transgender athletes suggest that transgender women who receive gender-affirming care have no clear biological advantages in elite sports, and may even perform worse, which completely obliterates the entire premise of these laws. But facts have never mattered to a movement animated by animus rather than evidence. The legislative strategy here reveals everything about Republican priorities because the new House made transgender students in sports one of its first priorities for 2025. While Americans are struggling with housing costs, healthcare expenses, student debt, climate catastrophe, and the erosion of democratic norms and institutions, but instead of addressing any material condition that affects the lives of millions of people, Republicans chose to spend their political capital persecuting a population that represents a fraction of 1% of student athletes, which tells you that the cruelty is the point, the stigmatization is the point, the creation of a class of untouchables who can be legally discriminated against is the point, because once you establish that principle you can expand it, and they are expanding it every single day. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez delivered what I consider one of the most important speeches of this entire debate when she said Republicans who have voted against the Violence Against Women Act, who have taken away the right of all women to choose and have control over their own body, who as women are bleeding out in parking lots across the country, now want to pretend they care about women, and they're doing it to open up gender, and yes, genital examinations into little girls in this country, in the so-called name of attacking trans girls. And this is the critique that should be plastered on every billboard in America, because it exposes the profound intellectual and moral bankruptcy of Republican claims to be protecting women, when their actual legislative record demonstrates nothing but contempt for women's autonomy, healthcare, and safety, and the deployment of supposed concern for female athletes rings especially hollow coming from a party that has spent decades defunding Title IX enforcement, cutting funding for women's sports programs, and installing judges who roll back protections against sexual harassment and assault. What makes this moment so dangerous is that Trump signed an executive order directing law enforcement to conduct investigations of educational institutions suspected of involvement in the instruction, advancement, or promotion of gender ideology, declaring such ideas to be anti-American and subversive, and directing law enforcement to criminally prosecute any teacher who unlawfully facilitates the social transition of a transgender minor, which means we've moved from legislative discrimination to criminal prosecution, to the deployment of federal law enforcement against teachers and schools that affirm trans students. And if this doesn't alarm you, then you haven't been paying attention to how authoritarian regimes consolidate power, because the sequence is always the same: legislative erasure, followed by criminalization, followed by enforcement terror, and we are watching that sequence unfold in real time. Senator Dick Durbin framed this with the moral clarity it deserves when he spoke about Harley Walker, a 16-year-old transgender girl from Alabama, who testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Harley told the committee, "She's a very happy 16-year-old, just trying to be a teenager in America, but keeps having to jump through hoops that other people her age don't have to, and she's there instead of enjoying summer vacation, just to try and ensure her right to exist isn't taken away." And that phrase, her right to exist, captures everything, because that's what's at stake here. Not athletic fairness, not protecting women's sports, but the fundamental question of whether trans people have the right to exist in public space, to participate in civic life, to be recognized as fully human. Republicans have decided the answer is no, and they're willing to traumatize countless children to enforce that answer. The intellectual framework Republicans are deploying borrows heavily from what we might call biologically essentialist determinism, which holds that sex assigned at birth determines every aspect of human identity and social participation forever and immutably, which is not only scientifically illiterate, it's also profoundly dangerous, because once you establish the principle that the state has the authority to define who counts as male and who counts as female based on narrow biological criteria, and then to enforce those definitions through surveillance, inspection, and exclusion, You've created a tool of social control that will inevitably be deployed against anyone whose body or identity doesn't conform to state-mandated norms, and we've seen this movie before. We know how it ends, and it always ends with mass suffering and dehumanization. Representative Mark Takano, chair of the Congressional Equality Caucus, and other Democrats correctly labeled this the Child Predator Empowerment Act, saying this bill isn't about protecting women, and in fact it could force any student to answer invasive personal questions about their bodies and face humiliating physical inspections to prove that they're a girl, and the name is not hyperbole, it's accurate description, because when you create legal structures that enable adults to demand access to children's bodies for the purposes of inspection and verification, you have literally empowered predators, and anyone who has spent 5 minutes studying child sexual abuse knows that abusers thrive in environments where there's ambiguity about boundaries, where children are taught that adults have the right to demand physical access, where questioning and inspection are normalized, and this bill creates precisely that environment. Now here's the part that should keep you up at night, which is that Democrats proposed amendments that would have added protections for female athletes whose gender is challenged, including one that would have prevented invasive inspections of genitalia, but Republicans rejected these amendments along party lines, which means when given the explicit opportunity to prohibit genital examinations, Republicans said no. They voted to keep that door open. They chose to maintain the possibility of state-mandated bodily inspection of children, and there is no interpretation of that vote that isn't monstrous, no framing that makes it anything other than a deliberate choice to empower abuse in the name of gender policing. The broader context here matters enormously, because this isn't happening in isolation. It's part of what ACLU lawyers describe as a sweeping effort to push transgender people out of public life altogether, and MAGA Republicans have introduced a flood of standalone bills and amendments, including those to police bathrooms, censor curriculum, gut federal non-discrimination protections, and ban transgender youth from playing sports, with new reports outlining the latest wave of anti-LGBTQ riders proposed by Republicans in their effort to weaponize appropriations bills, which represents the systematic deployment of state power across every level and domain of governance to make it impossible for trans people to exist safely in public space. And this is textbook minoritarian authoritarianism, where a political movement that can't win on popular economic policy and instead manufactures cultural panics to motivate their base and justify the expansion of state surveillance and control. What enrages me most about this entire manufactured crisis is that Representative Sarah McBride, the first openly transgender person elected to Congress, said we should be focused on bringing down the cost of housing, healthcare, and childcare, not manufacturing culture wars, which is exactly right, and reveals the profound asymmetry here, where Democrats want to talk about material conditions that affect people's lives, and Republicans want to talk about which bathroom a trans woman uses because they have nothing to offer on the actual crises facing Americans, so they manufacture crises that allow them to posture as defenders of tradition and protectors of children, while their actual policies immiserate working families. The enforcement question also reveals how these bills target not just trans kids but any girl who doesn't conform to narrow stereotypes of femininity, because the bill sets up an unfair playing field where any parent can raise a concern that a transgender girl might be playing on a girls' team, and it's unfair to girls who may be targeted because they grow faster, play harder, or simply may be more talented than their teammates, and could be subject to genital inspection and humiliation, which means tall girls, muscular girls, girls with high testosterone, girls who don't wear makeup, girls who have short hair, girls who excel at sports, all of them now exist under the threat of accusation, investigation, and forced examination, and this is how gender policing always works. It harms everyone by creating narrow corridors of acceptable presentation and punishing anyone who strays outside them. Hakeem Jeffries framed this with extraordinary moral clarity when he appeared on MSNBC, said to have the federal government weigh in aggressively and sanction invasive inspections would create a situation where childhood predators would be unleashed on the children of this country. And when the host described the enforcement mechanism as essentially genital checks, Jeffries agreed, saying that's correct. That's the plain reading of the bill, and that's why we characterized it as such. And this matters because it shows Democrats finally calling this what it is, not engaging in euphemism, not both sides, not worrying about offending moderates, but telling the truth about what Republicans are doing, which is creating legal infrastructure for the sexual abuse of children in the name of protecting them. The historical echoes here should terrify anyone with even a passing familiarity with how authoritarian movements operate, because the sequence is always identify, scapegoat, legislate, erasure, enforce through violence, and legislative attacks on transgender people grew exponentially over 2023 and 2024, and with these anti-trans laws directly causing an increase in suicide attempts in some states by up to 72%, and according to the CDC, 1 in 4 transgender youth have attempted to take their own life in the last year, which means this isn't abstract political theory, this is measurable harm. This is children dying because Republicans decided their existence is incompatible with MAGA ideology, and when I say this is fascism, I'm not being rhetorical, I'm being diagnostic, because what else do you call a political movement that deliberately targets a vulnerable minority for elimination from public life, and whose policies directly result in the deaths of children? What we need now is moral clarity and political courage, and Democrats showed both when they spoke out strongly on the Senate floor, and on social media pointing out the means to enforcing the bill is unclear, that it could endanger both cisgender and transgender girls by exposing them to invasive questions about their identities, and that the number of known trans student athletes in K-12 schools and colleges is quite small. Because this is how you fight back. Not by accepting Republican framing, not by trying to find middle ground between human rights and discrimination, but by telling the truth about what's happening and mobilizing people to stop it. And I'm here to tell you that this fight is not over, because Republicans will keep trying. They'll bring this back, they'll push it at the state level, they'll deploy executive orders and federal agencies, and the only thing that stops them is sustained organized resistance. Senator John Fetterman got this exactly right when he said, "The small handful of trans athletes in Pennsylvania in a political maelstrom deserve an ally, and he is one because they're depersonalized as they them in political ads, but are just school children, and empty show votes or cruelty on social media aren't part of a thoughtful, dignified solution. This is the recognition we need, that these are children. We're talking about children who want to play sports with their friends, children who are being used as political props and cultural warfare symbols by adults who have decided their suffering is acceptable, collateral damage in the quest for political power, and anyone who isn't enraged by that isn't paying attention." The final thing I'll say is that 70% of Americans say they are concerned that politicians are attacking gay and transgender youth to divide us, maintain their political power and control, and score political points. Yet MAGA Republicans are ignoring American fury over soaring prices and a collapsing economy and doubling down on their anti-LGBTQ crusade, which reveals that this has never been about popular demand or democratic responsiveness. It's about a minoritarian movement, using every lever of power to impose its vision on an unwilling population, and the only question that matters now is whether we're going to let them succeed, or whether we're going to build the kind of mass movement necessary to stop this and protect the most vulnerable among us, because history will judge us not by our words but by whether we stood up when it mattered. And right now, watching Pete Aguilar call this what it is, the GOP Child Predator Empowerment Act, I see someone who understands the stakes, who refuses to use euphemisms, who knows that sometimes the most important thing you can do is tell the truth as loudly as possible, and hope that enough people are listening to do something about it before it's too late.